precisamente toda la formación, trabajar en urbanismo. Y estoy en un centro de estudio que se llama Sandhurst, que es francés. Y tengo también tengo una co-dirección, tengo un director que es el agonista para el permiso de la pandemia, pues, que ya se llama Miguel Ángel Aguilar. ¿Me ubicas? Sí. Y pues tenía el año pasado tenía otra directora que se llama Criminalization, pero que falleció lamentablemente. Y pues ya como
¿Hay café? ¿Quieres café?
Bueno, gracias.
Hoy nos va a echar la mano con las preguntas que surjan del chat. Damos un minuto para anotar una gana.
Este está.
Venga, apagame el micrófono porque ya yo también, ¿no? Porque estamos directos. Entonces, nada más cerramos este. No. Pero vamos a escuchar. Se va a hacer la comunicación con la oficina de...
A ver. A ver. Parece que no se vicia, ¿no? Y se escucha en la transmisión. Perdón por estas fallas técnicas. De último, sí se oye. ¿Se oye? Sí, pero... Bueno, pues sí, perfecto. Pues vamos a inaugurar la tercera conferencia internacional de geógrafos, geógrafas y geografías anarquistas. Esta es la tercera conferencia internacional y tocó celebrarla en circunstancias muy difíciles, muy complicadas. La pandemia, la virtualidad, el confinamiento, de todas las actividades, las pérdidas, las tristezas, las distancias, todo ha sido muy complicado. No obstante, aquí estamos con la voluntad de volver a reunirnos y esta vez tocó hacer nuestra reunión en la ciudad de Oaxaca, una ciudad de una enorme riqueza cultural reconocida internacionalmente y además es una ciudad que es el epicentro de una región con una larguísima tradición de luchas sociales por la defensa del territorio y las culturas comunitarias, por lo cual creemos que es un lugar idóneo para una reunión de esta naturaleza, ¿no? Que conjuga las reflexiones sobre la geografía y el pensamiento libertario. Para que esto fuera posible, fue precisa la generosa colaboración de Surco AC, Servicios Universitarios y Redes de Conocimiento en Oaxaca, que nos proporcionó el lugar desde el que les estamos hablando, y no solo para la reunión física, sino pues toda la infraestructura tecnológica para que esa transmisión pudiera tener lugar y alcanzara pues a todos los participantes y las participantes diseminados y diseminadas en el planeta. Toda esta parte de la informática y la comunicación virtual pues se debe también a ello. Por todo eso agradecemos entrañablemente a Oliver Froelich, que es muy tímido, pero está ahí presente, que ha hecho posible esto. Y sin más, pues damos por inaugurada la tercera conferencia internacional de geógrafas y geografías anarquistas. Empezaremos con el primer panel, con la participación de Tom Tierman y Travis Van Issacher, Sara Bonatti, Giuseppe Forino y Gian Maria Valent, y Anthony Hines. En cuanto resolvamos algunas cuestiones de orden técnico, comenzaremos la transmisión de este primer panel. Muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos, no se desconecten, se va a poner esto buenísimo. Mil gracias, bueno, y buenos días. Cortamos el listón de la inauguración. Estaremos empezando en torno a las 10. Faltan 15, 10 hora de Oaxaca. Tienen tiempo de ir a prepararse un cafecito los que están en la mañana, a calentárselo, y empezamos a las 10 con la primera mesa que anunciábamos hace un momento. Mil gracias, muchas gracias, saludos a todas, a todos. Acá nos vemos.
Hi. Hello.
Muy bien, buenos días. Vamos a comenzar nuestro primer panel de la tercera conferencia internacional de geógrafas, geógrafos y geografías anarquistas. Como anunciábamos en la breve y atropellada inauguración, el primer panel está conformado por las participaciones de Anthony Ainz, Sara Bonatti, una primera de Anthony Ainz, la segunda de Tom Tierman y Travis Van Nissaker, y una tercera de Sara Bonatti, Giuseppe Forino y Gian Maria Val. Les recordamos a los participantes que tienen 20 minutos aproximadamente 20 minutos para sus intervenciones. Como son en su mayoría, esto lo digo para el público hispanohablante, como son en su mayoría participaciones que se darán en inglés, los usuarios del Zoom pueden utilizar en la barra de abajo, de comandos de abajo, hay un icono del mundo que dice interpretación, y pueden pulsar ahí interpretación para escucharlo en español, donde nuestro compañero Jerónimo aquí presente va a hacer una interpretación, una traducción aproximada de lo que los ponentes nos propongan. Vamos a empezar entonces con la ponencia de Anthony Ainz, que se llama Anarchy and Megaprojects Towards a Research Agenda on Mass Self-Organization and Foundational Infrastructures, es decir, anarquía y megaproyectos hacia una agenda de investigación sobre la autoorganización de masas y las infraestructuras fundacionales. Es una traducción muy bruta, pero funcional del asunto. Y ahora vamos a comenzar con la participación. Anthony, welcome. We're glad to hear you.
Wow, hello. Hi. Can I ask a quick question? Okay. I'm just talking all the way through and there's translation at the same time, or do I need to say a block and then wait?
If you can speak slowly, so Jerónimo can translate.
I will do my very best.
Oh, please. Please do it.
I'll just share Thank you very much. Gracias. And first of all, while I'm setting myself up, I have to apologize for not sending anything in advance. Unfortunately, I have no really good reason for that. I'm just ridiculously busy and I've done a lot of things at the last minute, unfortunately. Jerónimo probably knows a lot of this. So I'll try to speak carefully and clearly, and I can send the text to people if they prefer to read rather than listen. That's absolutely fine. And I'm sorry for leaving early as well. I have to teach today in half an hour. So I'm very much speaking from a Western European perspective, which has a well-established but relatively small anarchist movement for the most part, not everywhere. But and questions of mass organization and strategy, especially in the UK, where I'm based, have tended to be dominated by Marxist groups and tendencies whose statist and authoritarian modes of organization draw these discussions towards the role of the state as a savior, often based on abstract and wishful thinking, of course. So anarchists have long promoted the principles of federation and self-management as foundational organizational logics for imagining and building anarchist futures. But although these are theoretically consistent with anarchist principles, they remain unexplored, or underexplored, I should say, in relation to the kinds of large-scale complex projects that are required for contemporary societies to function and function well and give people a good quality of life. So things like transport infrastructure, major construction projects, healthcare, sanitation. And I think there are probably three main reasons for this. First of all, anarchists have been rightly reluctant to outline blueprints for a future society since the imposition of a certain order as an authoritarian move that doesn't sufficiently allow for truly democratic self-management in real-life contexts. And there's obviously well-known evidence of this in the Soviet Union, in China, and other places like that. And both before these socialist projects took place, people like Bakunin were already predicting these risks. And also after they happened, people like Emma Goldman in My Disillusionment in Russia actually documented these problems. So for this reason of being reluctant about promoting substantial and detailed blueprints for sort of mass societal organization, I think is very well founded. Secondly, I think, especially in the global north, anarchist movements, and especially in the UK where I'm talking about, because obviously there's much diversity in the global north, I should say. In the UK, at least in the last 40 years or so, the majority of specifically anarchist initiatives and projects related to these material necessities of life have often been local scale and relatively short-lived over the course of a few years, for example. And this means that anarchism in that context doesn't have a particularly large suite of examples to point towards as part of our kind of strategy. Thirdly, the examples of mass organization that do exist, organized along anarchist lines, such as the anarchist territories in Ukraine during the Russian Revolution, the Spanish Civil War, and so on, or more contemporary things like Rojava, autonomous self-governance in Rojava, have taken on quite mythological status, where details of the operation, certainly in the English-speaking world, are often secondary to the actual rhetorical power of the stories. Also, I think aside from the Zapatista territories, of course, a lot of these examples have operated in conflict zones, in exceptional contexts, and it's very difficult to apply those principles to sort of what we might call normal times. So what I'm asking today is, what might an anarchist perspective on mega projects, large-scale planning, and both physical and social infrastructure look like? What might it feel like? And what existing ideas can we pull together and draw from? So it's slightly speculative, it's unfinished, it's not a project that has started yet, it's just thinking about a project. And I'm focusing on three main areas of thought. First of all, a growing body of literature in political economy on the foundational economy and so-called new municipalism. Also a growing body of literature across the social sciences concerning infrastructure and its politics and operation. And then also some fragmentary but insightful anarchist perspectives that we can repurpose to these ends. So let's begin with the foundational economy. Social democratic social science, so reformist left social science, clustering around the notion of foundational economy, has pursued a shift in state socialist thinking towards what they call the foundational elements of society in order to develop ways of re-enlivening public ownership. My colleague, Kevin Morgan, is one of these people, and he defines it in these terms. It refers to the basic requirements of civilized life for all citizens, including material infrastructure, so pipes, cables, utilities, and providential services, what they call providential services like education, health, food provisioning, care, and income maintenance. And so it is very much a social democratic project to confront the worst excesses of capital, neoliberal and speculative capital especially. And they usefully identify some of the fundamental elements that provide most people with a decent quality of life. And they say, well, we need to focus on these. And as anarchists, we can critique their approach on a number of registers. So, for example, their naive optimism about the benign nature of the state, a belief that a centrally planned capitalism can overcome a free market capitalism, and so on. And also in this quote, terms like civilized and citizens, I think, are quite problematic too. But we also can recognize the rhetorical power and real life impacts of identifying and prioritizing these mundane elements of daily life. Anarchists rarely talk about sanitation and engineering and these kinds of things, and maybe we should. At the same time, I won't talk about it as much, but there's a so-called new municipalist field of studies, especially in geography, but not only, that has very strong crossovers with the foundational economy thinkers. And they focus on a number of actually existing city-scale projects that draw together public participation and public ownership, so nationalization, I guess you could say, to promote new forms of public ownership and public services for the kind of the contemporary period following the decline of centralized nationally owned industries throughout the late 20th century. So, although anarchists would generally not support these kinds of projects, or would do so very, very critically, because of their retention of state centrism and state control, as well as, of course, the continuation of capitalist relations of production and consumption. This rethinking of economic relations does resonate, I think, with some trends within anarchism and the wider libertarian left that are worth revisiting. So historically, there have been various efforts to provide, for example, alternative models of industry, of production, such as Anton Panachek's left communist vision in his book Workers' Councils, which is a very meticulous study, I must say, perhaps a little too prescriptive and frankly a little bit boring to read. Now, obviously, Panachek wasn't an anarchist and didn't ascribe to the anarchist critique of blueprints, like I mentioned before. But the structures and relations he outlines in his work certainly connect closely to a vision of anarchist self-management of workplaces. Likewise, the 20th century syndicalist movement, although not entirely or explicitly anarchist, also developed systems and principles for workers' control, or the transfer of workers' control of the economy, that I think have been overlooked in geography. Syndicalism is very under-researched, and I think perhaps unfairly under-researched as well, especially the enduring appeal of syndicalism in practice through contemporary syndicalist unions. Perhaps most clearly, Butchin's libertarian municipalism is also worth thinking more carefully, especially in light of its increased popularity around the Syrian situation. So that's something I'm not going to go into great detail about, but it's definitely there. And more recently, there's been an interesting text by the anarchist collective Crime Think, based in the US, who've outlined what they call the opposite of a political program, to articulate a vision of what is essentially public ownership of basic services, but from an anarchist perspective. And I think this is quite an important development, although it deliberately focuses on principles rather than concrete proposals, to clearly navigate away from this prescriptive, authoritarian, centralized approach that state socialists would have had. Sorry, I'm recovering from a cold. I think it makes a fairly substantial contribution, a substantial attempt to do something that anarchists have often been shy of trying to do, to propose a political program with concrete suggestions for how an anarchist society might work and provide foundational services on a large scale. So I suppose the questions I'm raising in this point are, it's really, why should social democrats claim a monopoly on thinking about these foundational elements of daily life in a systematic, rigorous academic sense, when anarchists and other left libertarians have a lot of tools at our disposal to do the same. Another very connected element is the issue of infrastructure. You know, it's central to the foundational economy, and it's also it's traditionally focused primarily on pipes, cables, roads, concrete, these kinds of things that allow for the physical circulation of people and materials. But an increasingly well-established field of study across geography and the social sciences, infrastructure has then become more broadly understood as the architectures of circulation, relating to also information, well-being, even things like desire has an infrastructural element. So infrastructural systems have been argued to be economized, socialized, and politicized as sites of investment and disinvestment, as well as spaces of cultural representation. In general, then, there's a distinction between physical infrastructure, the pipes and cables and roads, and social infrastructure, which focuses more on the institutional arrangements, which can be state institutions and non-state institutions that sustain communities. And both of these forms of infrastructure are important when we're thinking about the material realities of sustaining societies. Now, if we look at the policy discourse, it very much, as you would imagine, serves status agendas for both centralization of control within the state and decentralization of responsibility to residents. So, for example, in the UK, over the last 10 years, there's been a massive outsourcing of previously state-provided welfare and public services to charities and community groups, which has been a classic example of neoliberal responsibilization, as they call it, whereby the state enhances its control through arm's-length funding streams and things like that, while offloading responsibility for its residents' welfare to their fellow residents, not as a form of liberation, as a form of self-management, but as a form of essentially control, enhancing the state's power through other means. So within this context, rather loose definitions prevail within this world. So they talk about the infrastructure as the glue that holds communities together, or something that makes an area more than just a place to live. So it's very fuzzy, it's very not very helpful. And again, centers on monolithic notions like community or neighborhood or city that actually erase material struggles and inequalities linked to gender, race, class, citizenship, and so on. Now, critical and radical geographers across the kind of the lefty geography spectrum have been quick to push back against these dominant policy discourses around infrastructure, and various alternative conceptualizations of infrastructure have emerged. I mean, for example, fugitive infrastructures by Winston, which has very recently been written, that are sort of trying to focus on the politics of this kind of dominant state-led infrastructures, as well as identifying infrastructural practices that create autonomous structures of counterpower. Now, if we look at anarchism and its emphasis on self-management and do-it-yourself ethic of direct action, it doesn't fit very well with the dominant policy discourses around infrastructure. But it does provide insights into how anarchists might conceive of infrastructure as a vernacular and a prefigurative process, similar to the kind of thing, the kind of thinking undertaken by people like Colin Ward and Murray Bookchin, who in the English language at least are probably the foremost thinkers of public service delivery, if you want to use that kind of term. Separately, contemporary anarchist scholars of social movements have used the term infrastructure to articulate how radical social movements create architectures of circulation in order to maximize their power and their leverage within political struggles. So, for example, Jeff Shantz, the anarchist sociologist, has discussed the idea of infrastructures of resistance, and a number of other people as well. So it's a useful term for explaining the operational architectures of social movements, but it hasn't been applied quite so much towards thinking about how anarchist ideas can drive new paradigms in thinking about mass infrastructures more broadly. But despite this, the same anarchist principles that are discussed in social movement studies of prefiguration, of federation and self-management do lend themselves well to thinking about infrastructural systems and highlight practices also of maintenance, of repair, of retrofitting that are very well documented in the wider literature as central to all infrastructural systems and how they develop over time. Finally, in terms of infrastructure, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, rather than us all being in the same room, where many of us are far away, unfortunately, but there is a small but growing body of work around local mutual aid networks, certainly in the UK and I know beyond as well, where we've seen anarchistic forms of organisation developing through a wide range of community-based initiatives, nominally apolitical for the most part, but cut across political differences to provide the necessary means of survival to isolated and vulnerable groups. So people like Rhiannon Firth have written about this very eloquently. Sorry, I've lost my page. Okay, so anarchist specialisms in sort of self-managed forms of organisation within our movements, alongside a reappraisal of previous writers like Colin Ward, have, I think, the potential to create a window on new ways to imagine how infrastructures can be organised and managed without recourse to hierarchical command structures. And there's also a wider body of work, which I can't talk about today because of time, people like Thomas Swan talking about anarchist organisation studies, where he talks about various kind of organisational principles, but let's not go there today. So finally, you'll be glad to hear, we see that there are opportunities to engage in some important dynamics, both within academic study and also potentially wider society. Existing scholarship is very heavily focused, like I said, on social democratic reformist priorities of regulating capital through state control. But there's also a range of anarchist and left libertarian entry points into these topics that I think haven't been explored as systematically, collectively, as they might otherwise have been. But what this does is throw up a whole range of other questions that, again, I don't have time to talk about today. For example, debates over the role of technology and things like smart cities. Could a smart city be retrofitted according to anarchist principles? The relative centralisation and decentralisation of public services. Would large city hospitals have a place to play, or would it be smaller community-based ones, for example? And also the prioritisation or deprioritisation of different forms of urban development and rural development, I should say. So major civil construction projects like bridges and tunnels and so on might still be relevant within an anarchist framework, but other things like tourism developments or certain housing projects might not be. Finally, this stuff is all very lovely to talk about as academics, But one element that I think would be really beneficial to embed in some kind of project like this would be to ensure that there is some kind of activist take-home messages, useful things that can be offered back to anarchists on the ground doing their thing. So that's probably the hardest part of it. And that's the part that I'm going to end on. So this is really very speculative, like I say, but I'd just be really interested in hearing your thoughts and reflections. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Sorry if I spoke quickly.
Muchas gracias. Anthony. Tenemos un problema técnico. A ver ahora. Ahí está. Perfecto. Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. Ahora sigue la presentación de Tom Tierman y Travis Issacher, Post-Brexit Border Securitization in the Channel. O sea, el aseguramiento de fronteras en el canal después del Brexit. Vamos a hacer ahora un relevo. Jerónimo va a moderar la mesa y yo voy a tratar de hacer la interpretación en la medida de mis posibilidades, la interpretación al español. Entonces, recuerden, tienen 20 minutos, 20 minutes to your presentation, please. So, welcome, Travis.
Thank you very much, Alejandro.
Go ahead.
I'm Travis, and this is Tom. Say hi, Tom. Or not?
Hi, everyone.
Great. So, as Alejandro mentioned, we will talk about the UK border, and especially the UK border in France and how it has changed in the last few years. I will give a bit of context to the situation in Calais and to the development of people crossing the border by sea, and then Tom will. And then we'll speak about the responses from the UK government to this phenomenon, and then Tom will end with some analysis about what this shows us around how kind of white supremacist border imperialism is reconfiguring itself in the UK and then also more globally. So I'm speaking to you from Calais, France, which is since the late 90s, where the UK border is present in the French territory. So that means that people who want to go to the UK have to pass immigration control here in France. And for those who don't have the correct documents, they're not able to go and continue their journeys. And as you probably know, people who want to claim asylum, they first have to cross borders irregularly, and then once they're on the territory of, in this case, United Kingdom, then they can launch an asylum claim and receive protection from the British state. So you have a lot of people here who are trying to claim asylum in the UK who first have to cross this border without being caught by the authorities. So for many years, since 2002, there has not been an official accommodation for these people. And so they've been living throughout the city, squatting buildings, living in camps, also constantly hunted by the police who try to push them out. So that they're not here, it's more difficult for them to cross. Maybe you will have seen in 2015, there were around 10,000 people who were living in what became known as the jungle. This was a place where the British, or the French and the British government decided to segregate the entire migrant population of Calais because they were living before within the city, taking squats, living very visibly, and the local politicians didn't want them to be as visible in the city, so they segregated them into this camp, which then grew and grew to at its largest around 10,000 people. Following that, they destroyed the camp and they introduced a lot of security, and the ferry terminal and the train which meant that people had to try. Well, it was much more difficult for people to cross to the UK by boat or by ferry or by train, and so many people started taking to the sea in small boats as the only way to go. And this happened in 2018. So since 2018, we've seen each year a tripling of the number of people who try to go in small boats, in little dinghies. And this year, I think it's upwards of 30,000 people have crossed. Of course, both the British and the French government have reacted to try and stop people traveling by this way. And what we've seen is that in 2020 and last year, there was £30 million given from the British to the French in order to introduce more police patrols along the beaches to try and stop people from leaving on shore. They also spent the money on drones to try and detect people on the beaches and then send the police to stop them before they could leave. We've also seen increased returns or deportations of people that do make it. Last year, now that stopped after UK left the European Union. They've no longer been able to deport to European countries, but there were a lot of deportations of people who arrived by boat. And then there's also been the kind of militarization of the channel. So in August last year, when many people started crossing all at once, we saw the Royal Air Force deploying airplanes to try and surveil what was going on. We've seen Border Force buying drones to find the boats and to make sure that everyone who's crossing they can know and they can apprehend. So this is what we've seen kind of happening on the ground, but this hasn't stopped people from crossing. And at the same time that we have this kind of increases in border security, there's also now at the moment the new borders. It's a new borders law which the UK is bringing in, and this law is also a response to the boat crossings. And what the Home Secretary says is that this law will break the model of the people smugglers, and it's a law which is designed to basically convince people that they shouldn't come to the UK or that they can't come to the UK. There are a few different aspects of the law that we'd like to discuss, but it's bringing in a lot of changes, many of which are inconsistent with the UK's obligations under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Refugee Convention, and all of these kind of larger international legal treaties. It's a national law which is like overturning many of those things in the UK. So the first thing we wanted to highlight was the criminalization of arrival. So now in the new law, just simply arriving in the UK shores will be a criminal offense, so that everyone who's coming to claim asylum will have already committed a crime and then can be subject to court proceedings and imprisonment if convicted. This is trying to create a separation between people who come by themselves, who move autonomously, and then people who wait to enter the UK through different relocation programs, which of course don't work for the majority of the people who need to travel here. We also see the what they call the returns to third countries. So now people who do make it to the UK are liable to be deported to another country, and it's either their home country, any country that they have a connection to, which there's no legal definition of what that means to have a connection to a country, but they can deport you there, or any country that people may have traveled through. So with this aspect of the law, they want to make it so if you come from France, that the UK can send you back to France, or can send you back to Turkey, or can send you back to anywhere that they believe you've traveled from. Now, for the moment, these countries haven't accepted these returns, and they wouldn't be able to do it without cooperation from other countries, but this is in the new law. There are also what are called pushback powers, so which is giving the border force at sea on the boats the legal authority to push migrants back into French waters. So border force are not able to recognize an asylum claim or to accept an asylum claim at sea, it has to be on the UK territory. And then they're also able to divert boats legally. At the same time, there will be immunity for border force officers if they kill people or if they injure people in the course of these operations. So they won't be able to be prosecuted criminally or have civil complaints taken out against them. Finally, there's, in addition to the criminalization, there is the increase in the penalty for facilitation, so what they call smuggling, to a maximum of life in prison. And we see that they want people to think that if they cross to the UK by themselves, that they won't be able to settle and make their life there. And this is again trying to go back to breaking people's will to come to this country. And how they want to do that is by making people's asylum claims inadmissible, which means that if they claim asylum in the UK government can actually refuse to hear the claim, not process it, but cast it out and then try and deport that person. Now, they can do this for 6 months, and then if they haven't deported the person within 6 months, then they should begin to look at the claim. But even in the case that that claim is successful, they're creating a second class of refugee protection, which doesn't allow people the same security in their status. It doesn't allow, for example, right to public funds. They can constantly be reassessed for removal, in that even if they have this temporary status, they can still be deported at any time to their home country, to a third country, or to another country that will take them. And this sets up, and also it's unclear if they will have the right to housing. And so this sets up what Tom will begin discussing about, which is the kind of expansion of the detention estate and the wholesale relocation of asylum seekers into short-term holding facilities, essentially, rather than accommodation.
Great, thanks, Travis, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to speak to you today. So the final part of the Nationality and Borders Bill we would like to highlight is what they call reception centres for asylum seekers, which essentially are a way of blurring the lines between kind of asylum accommodation, which has a humanitarian role, and immigration detention, which has a punitive and administrative role. And it basically makes way for a policy of detaining all new arrivals in the UK with the intention to fast track them through the asylum, detention, and ultimately deportation process. And we're already getting a sense of what these new reception centres will look like. For the last few years, the UK has detained new arrivals across the Channel in former army barracks across the UK. And these are kind of dilapidated, overcrowded, they have minimal basic infrastructure, lack of access to medical services, things like this. And while residents are technically free to come and go from these centres, they're very isolated, they're in the middle of nowhere, very far from towns or villages, and therefore isolated from support, solidarity, legal advice, stuff like this. At the same time, though, what we're seeing is a larger number of people being detained as what they call foreign national offenders in prisons. Many of these people are people who have leave to remain in the UK, but not full citizenship status. And essentially, there are rules in place where if you've been sentenced to 12 months prison or more, often for very minor offences, then you're subject to automatic deportation from the UK. The final thing that the bill introduces is electronic tagging of asylum seekers who are released into the community, as well as the ability of the Home Office to deprive people of citizenship without notice. And this includes people who've been born in the UK and also people who have not. So essentially what we're seeing after decades of criminalization, and now with this criminalization of asylum, is the UK expanding its detention estate and extending the means of kind of carceral control in new forms throughout society. And this is a kind of drastic deepening of its kind of hostile policies against migrants, and is in many senses a radical step to sort of circumscribe and restrict who can and cannot be counted as British, who's allowed to belong, and who's allowed to access rights in relation to the state and to society. Recently, a Home Office spokesman, a spokesman for the government, kind of stated that British citizenship is a privilege, not a right. And we might, add here that it's a privilege that's heavily racialized. Okay. One of the things that we're really seeing with this new bill, with these changes in the UK, is the bringing together of criminal policing and border control in a way that disproportionately targets racialized communities in the UK, rendering them deportable, and in doing so, making their citizenship and belonging conditional. And so like what we're seeing is like everyday police interactions, that are already deeply discriminatory and racialized, stop and searches, pulling cars over to check vehicle, driver's licenses, things like this, are now having this added layer of border control enforcement sort of overlaid on top of them, with people referred, with police checking sort of immigration documents and then referring them to the border force. And these are, measures that are disproportionately targeting Black and Asian populations and communities in Britain, whose kind of kinship ties are often not seen as like fitting within the kind of state's definition of Britishness. Okay, so by way of a bit of kind of analysis then, thinking of what some of the academic concepts we might use to make sense of this, this is very much an early stage of us kind of thinking about this kind of piece of writing. So I'm just going to throw out some ideas. So within the discipline of criminology, you get this concept of crimigration, which describes how criminal justice and immigration law and enforcement practices are increasingly overlapping. And that seems to capture something about how kind of border controls are increasingly bound up with policing of organized crime and terrorism, and how diverse security agencies and their agendas align. Within geography, there's been a kind of valuable focus on carcerality and how carceral regimes of discipline and control have expanded beyond the prison and criminal justice system. So, for example, the idea of the carceral archipelago has been used to explore how tactics of offshoring immigration detention and asylum processing works as a kind of tactic of controlling mobility through creating these sort of extraterritorial spaces that are kind of distanced and isolated and invisible and remote. And that's a way of kind of controlling physically and preventing physically kind of migrants' mobility, but also rendering migrants' legal status ambiguous and restricting their access to rights. And these carceral tactics are often understood as inherently spatial. And they're kind of seen as kind of confining migrants to conditions of exteriority, keeping people outside, excluded, stuff like this. But also there's a kind of literature on carceral mobilities that points out that these tactics don't simply use geography to restrict mobility, but they also entail forced mobility, deportations, expulsions, transfers. And perhaps more importantly, the kind of logics of carcerality themselves are seen as mobile. So on the one hand, carceral logics are seen as kind of increasingly used as fixes to all sorts of different social problems in society, right? From welfare provision to asylum and so on. On the other hand, these kind of carceral technologies and techniques of controlling migration are shared between states. So for example, UK policies to criminalize asylum, establish offshore detention facilities, enact pushbacks can be seen as directly borrowed from the USA or Australia, or even the European Union, right? Ironically. But while these literatures, brilliant, 4 minutes. I will be done in 4 minutes. Thank you for the heads up. So while these literatures provide important insights into kind of the techniques that are used to control mobility across borders, what is perhaps missing is their kind of broader contextualization within ongoing dynamics of kind of colonialism and post-colonialism. So some scholars such as Radhika Mongia and Nandita Sharma show that the kind of control of mobility was at the heart of the operation of European empire and the kind of European controlled empires. From kind of forced enslavement and transportation of people from the African continent to the American plantations, or the enclosure of indigenous populations in white settler colonies, to movement of indentured workers across the empire after the abolition of slavery, the control of mobility has been fundamental to establishing the kind of racial capitalism that continues to shape our global political economy today. And contemporary nation-state borders function to kind of inherit that and that kind of form, and to sort of enforce what some have called a global apartheid, which restricts the movements of predominantly Black people in the global South, while facilitating the relatively free movement of predominantly white people in the global North. Importantly, this apartheid is maintained through enforcing a hierarchy of citizenship rather than explicitly racial categories. And, you know, this is one of the ways in which, national citizenship, we've got to understand, has been effectively racialized through the historical construction of borders. So as a result, as kind of Nadine El-Anani puts it, nation states and citizenship in the global North, countries such as Britain, were not only bordered, but also racially and colonially ordered through the operation of immigration control in ways that kind of have ensured the spoils of empire and extraction and dispossession were retained for the privileged few. So the reason why we point out the kind of post-coloniality of contemporary borders is that we think it's useful for making sense of these recent developments in the UK in a number of ways. And I'll just quickly summarize them and then I'm done. First, it allows us to appreciate the kind of ongoing power of fantasies of empire in British popular imaginary, both as a kind of underpinning for this like jingoistic bravado of like global Britain, but also as in the kind of post-colonial anxieties concerning Britain's waning political and economic power. And both of these are deeply entrenched expressions of white supremacist logics that shaped the British Empire and continue to shape how the British state reforms itself today. The second implication is that it allows us to think slightly differently, but together, about the ways in which the British state is increasing its carceral reach, both domestically and internationally at the same time. And kind of think here, you know, these kind of the ways in which to do this is one of the ways in which the kind of segregation and racialized policing that underpins this global apartheid system is carried out, right? And third and finally, it allows us to move beyond a sort of methodologically nationalist understanding of borders, carceral institutions, and state power to appreciate how the British example is actually part of a wider process of kind of global activity of bordering. One that, rather than seeing kind of states sharing and borrowing policies off each other, actually acknowledges that bordering involves many more actors, not just states, but also private companies and kind of security officials and police and sort of technology producers, right? Acting and collaborating across multiple sites around the world. And sort of engage in a wide range of policy areas and activities, not just border security, but police training and military intervention and development aid. And I think while this isn't a sort of centralized or coherent kind of sort of project, I think what we can see is that in these multiple different spaces, we can see them as sort of imperial laboratories of governance. Which is a kind of quote from Césaire. And I think the final point then is to say that, I think contextualizing British borders today within this kind of global context helps us understand, I think, some of these dynamics that are currently underway in the kind of global bordering activities that we are witnessing emerging around the world, and maybe kind of give us some insights, hopefully, for what a politics of border abolition could involve and look like. Okay, thanks very much.
Sí. Bueno, muchas gracias. Thank you very much. Travis. No, pero es que sí, sí me escuchan. Thank you very much, Travis. Vamos a pasar a la siguiente y última ponencia de este panel. Es Unpacking the Structural Violence in Italian Earthquakes Recovery 2009-2019 de Sara Bonatti, Giuseppe Polino y Liliana María Vanés. Si estamos presentadores. Sí. Vamos a darle la palabra a Liliana María.
Hola.
Hola.
Bueno, soy María Valen y hoy presento una búsqueda que es todavía en curso y que estoy realizando junto a mis compañeros Sara Bonatti y Giuseppe Forino. La investigación se refiere a los aspectos de violencia institucional encontrados en la gestión del post-terremoto en Italia, desde el de L'Aquila en 2009 hasta el de Ischia en 2017. Bueno, esta es una búsqueda en el lado oscuro, permítame el término. El fin es reconocer las formas de actuar del Estado italiano, un Estado europeo occidental, formalmente democrático, que aprovecha de situaciones de emergencia generadas por desastres, en nuestro caso terremotos, imponiendo una serie de políticas de marco neoliberal que definimos como violentas. No tanto y no solo visiblemente y directamente violentas sobre el cuerpo de las personas, sino sobre el territorio, las relaciones que lo construyen y lo configuran, las relaciones entre el territorio y sus habitantes y entre los habitantes mismos. Investigar los casos italianos que voy a describir nos permite reconocer la continuidad y captar el carácter sistemático de estas políticas, aplicadas durante una década por diferentes gobiernos y apoyadas por mayorías políticas de orientaciones en teoría muy lejanas. Los casos tratados en este estudio son principalmente 4. L'Aquila 2009, el cual discutiré de manera más amplia porque fue el inicio del nuevo modelo de intervención en desastres. Y luego intentaré identificar los elementos en común con otros tres, que son Emilia-Romagna, 2012, Italia Central, en el 2016, más Casamicciola en Isla de Ischia en 2017, que a pesar de haber afectado un área mínima en comparación con los otros, sin embargo registró algunos elementos comunes con esto. No, basándonos en la literatura sobre la violencia del neoliberalismo, argumentamos que este no implica la retirada del Estado, por el contrario, la conexión cada vez más estrecha entre instituciones e intereses económicos fomenta un aumento de la violencia y del autoritarismo. La estrategia de intervención establecida en los cuatro casos, aunque con las diferencias debidas a distintas situaciones y configuraciones territoriales de las zonas afectadas, se puede resumir como una combinación de políticas de desregulación y la aplicación concurrente de un control estricto sobre el pueblo. Un sistema de acción dual, típicamente neoliberal, consistente en una política de no injerencia hasta las empresas, combinada con fuertes intervenciones estatales destinadas a prevenir o a reprimir la acción social. Perdón. Bueno. En L'Aquila, la estrategia se estableció bajo la autoridad del comisario extraordinario, a quien el primer ministro otorgó plenos poderes para gestionar el proceso de recuperación en la zona. Para facilitar a los operadores económicos y promover un modelo de reconstrucción bien definido, se aplicó una amplia derogación de las normas urbanísticas, leyes de transparencia de los contratos públicos y normas de protección laboral. Se derogaron más de 100 artículos de la ley y se ejerció un control estricto sobre los ciudadanos, los medios de comunicación y las autoridades locales. L'Aquila fue el primer gran desastre afrontado en Italia en el nuevo milenio y marcó el inicio de un modelo de intervención mucho más autoritaria que en el pasado, y luego repetido en los eventos siguientes. Este modelo es asumido en el paradigma del mando y control y encarnado por la estructura del comisionado extraordinario, según un modelo de arriba hacia abajo fuertemente centralizado, en quien todas las decisiones fueron tomadas por el comisionado y aplicadas por la estructura DICOMAC-COM. Este se compuso en la base por los COM, son distritos que incluyen uno o más municipios previstos por la Ley de Protección Civil para coordinar las intervenciones de emergencia. En L'Aquila han sido utilizados de manera impropia, transformándose en un medio de aplicar las directivas del comisionado y defenestrar a las administraciones locales y a la población, marcando una primera reorganización heterodirecta del territorio. El DICOMAC, que es la Dirección de Mando y Control, es una estructura no prevista por ninguna ley, creada expresamente en L'Aquila por la primera vez y luego utilizada en eventos sísmicos posteriores. Agrupaba todas las funciones de los COM a nivel más alto y además tenía competencias exclusivas en la información, propaganda y relaciones con la prensa. Esta nueva entidad, completamente externa y llena a la sociedad de L'Aquila, marcó nuevos límites y topónimos sobre los existentes y redefinió a las autoridades pertinentes y sus áreas de competencia. Un elemento muy importante de transformación territorial ha sido el del proyecto CASE. 19 grupos de edificios construidos en zonas rurales para albergar a 14.000 personas sin hogar. Las obras, las licitaciones, las asignaciones de vivienda fueron decididas por la estructura del comisionado sin consultar a ningún otro, ni al alcalde, ni al ayuntamiento, ni menos todo a la ciudadanía. Bueno, como mencioné en la introducción, en esta búsqueda el término violencia no tiene el significado común de violencia física, detención arbitraria o restricciones sobre una persona o un grupo. aunque las secuelas del terremoto del Aquila vieron la aplicación de restricciones que podrían considerarse violentas en este sentido, desde la limitación del derecho de reunión en los campamentos, prohibición no justificada por el tipo de emergencia, sino dirigida únicamente a prevenir la acción colectiva, al desplazamiento forzoso que ha desmembrado comunidades de barrios, de pueblos y en unos casos también de familias, realizado sin relación con las comunidades. Y no es un caso si David Alexander define la intervención del Estado en L'Aquila con el término militar overwhelming force, porque el ejército fue desplegado en modo muy masivo en L'Aquila. La violencia menos reconocible como tal que queremos remarcar, pero se ha ejercido sobre el territorio y sobre el cuerpo de la ciudadanía en su conjunto. Y se ha aplicado en un proceso en desarrollo, más que como un evento único. Esta violencia fue infligida durante la movilización masiva de personal y equipos gubernamentales para ocupar el territorio y también en el enfoque puramente técnico de recuperación que redujo la complejidad territorial y abrió el camino a la especulación y la explotación, particularmente al turismo y a la industria de construcción. Se hizo violencia a las comunidades locales al excluirla de los procesos de toma de decisiones. Finalmente, las personas mismas experimentaron violencia al ser tratadas como sujetos sin voz, en lugar de ciudadanos con la capacidad y el derecho de desempeñar un papel activo en la recuperación. En L'Aquila se impidió deliberadamente la implicación de las personas y las organizaciones de base. Y la capacidad del pueblo para actuar y reaccionar y participar, y sobre todo su necesidad de hacerlo, fue descartada o reemplazada por el intervencionismo en la toma de decisiones y la retórica del gobierno. El gobierno, a través de la protección civil, actuó como catalizador en el proceso de desterritorialización en curso, desencadenado por el sismo. Y en lugar de impulsar y sustentar la acción local y sustituirla solo cuando fuera necesario, sustituyó a las instituciones locales por una estrategia tecnocrática y extraterritorial, aliena y buena para cada situación. La velocidad de ejecución del proyecto CASE sugiere que estaba preempaquetada, esperando una ocasión, y que L'Aquila era un laboratorio experimental de este modelo de intervención, que destaca por su fuerte orientación empresarial. La desregulación a gran escala que el gobierno autorizó, lejos de ser una simple herramienta para manejar una emergencia, es una clara marca de violencia neoliberal, liderada por el Estado contra una parte del territorio nacional, que fue tratado como una tierra para ser explotada y no un territorio para ser recuperado. Análogo como Klein, Adams y Rivlin han señalado a lo ocurrido en New Orleans después del huracán Katrina. Bueno, L'Aquila fue escenario de una reorganización heterodirecta de la sociedad y del territorio. Y fue un ejercicio de reestructuración en el que la sociedad local no perdió el control, sino el gobierno se lo llevó a fuerza. Bueno, no todos los elementos que encontramos en L'Aquila son presentes en la gestión de terremotos posteriores. Los aspectos menos defendibles se han suavizado con diversos expedientes, como el nombramiento como comisionados de los presidentes de las regiones afectadas o la diferente gestión interna de los campamentos de desplazados. Sin embargo, podemos agregar que lo que también observamos más adelante es la persistencia de una política autoritaria en el manejo de la postemergencia. Quedan, de hecho, los elementos más relevantes en la gestión de emergencias posteriores, que he intentado resumir en este diagrama. Primero, una desregulación masiva que ha dejado mano libre a la especulación. En Ischia incluso hubo una amnistía por abusos de construcciones previos. Este es el elemento que más contribuye al despliegue de un poder arbitrario y sin ningún control por parte de los llamados órganos de garantía. La seguridad jurídica cae incluso en el nivel puramente formal al que nos han acostumbrado las democracias europeas. La exclusión total de la ciudadanía de los procesos de reconstrucción. En ninguno de los casos examinados se incluyó a las poblaciones locales en los procesos de reconstrucción, ni tampoco en la futura organización de sus territorios y lugares de vida. Eran simplemente sujetos a gestionar. Bueno, tercero, el reasentamiento forzoso. Lejos de los lugares de vida, en hoteles de la costa, sobre todo en L'Aquila y Italia Central. En Emilia-Romagna, el reasentamiento forzoso tenía un componente de clase, afectando especialmente a las personas pobres y a los inmigrantes sin redes parentales. La mayoría de los desplazados en Emilia-Romagna ha buscado un alojamiento autónomo para evitar los campos de la protección civil, conscientes de lo ocurrido en L'Aquila. Cuarto elemento común, grandes retrasos en la reconstrucción y falta de planes. Una acción precisa de no planificar un futuro para los territorios afectados, dejando casi todo a la iniciativa privada de las empresas de construcción y turismo. En el centro de Italia encontramos una estrategia particular, es la estrategia del abandono, llamada. Dado el tamaño del área en cuestión y la baja densidad de población, se consideró que desde un punto de vista económico no valía la pena reconstruir en muchos municipios pequeños. No fue una decisión oficial, porque habría sido indefendible y motivo de protesta. Simplemente no se ha hecho nada. En muchos casos ni siquiera se han retirado los escombros y los habitantes aún permanecen en las habitaciones provisionales que se han vuelto permanentes. Después de 5 años, el resultado es que las personas han sido expulsadas definitivamente de sus lugares de vida. El territorio está abandonado y los pueblos siguen en ruina. En L'Aquila, por lo tanto, nació un sistema que va más allá del estado de emergencia como lo era hasta el 2009 y que ha sido replicado en los eventos posteriores. Un sistema de excepciones indefinidas, de arbitrariedad, de anulación de la seguridad jurídica. Todos los elementos que quiero recordar se han aplicado en un país de Europa Occidental, gobernado por un régimen parlamentario democrático. No me quedaré aquí para retomar las críticas a la democracia que los anarquistas siempre hemos conocido y realizado, pero lo que me interesa es la transformación de la llamada democracia liberal en democracia neoliberal. Bueno, el Estado italiano ejerció la violencia neoliberal sobre el pueblo, sobre el territorio, con un conjunto de acciones políticas, cada una de las cuales tuvo un efecto fortalecedor sobre las demás, para que puedan ser vistas como un todo orgánico, una estrategia, una praxis. El principal resultado del modelo de intervención autoritario aplicado en L'Aquila y similarmente visto en Centro Italia ha sido un serio vínculo sobre el futuro de las personas y el territorio, influyendo fuertemente en el futuro de estas zonas. Parcialmente diferente a los casos de Emilia-Romagna y Ischia, donde las características territoriales y sociales no permitieron una intervención tan fuerte, aunque actuando en la misma dirección. Bueno, la conclusión, por el momento solo provisional, de este trabajo es que la violencia estructural y el autoritarismo son elementos clave de las políticas del Estado italiano para hacer frente a desastres y emergencias. Personalmente, en un trabajo anterior, había planteado la hipótesis de que la gestión de la emergencia en L'Aquila había sido una especie de laboratorio, una forma de experimentar con la aplicación de métodos autoritarios para afrontar futuras emergencias, tanto reales como solo declaradas. El comportamiento del Estado italiano en los desastres posteriores y en los 2 últimos años hace que esta hipótesis sea un poco más sólida. Bueno, como decía al principio, creemos que es importante hacer reconocible el autoritarismo y la violencia del poder, especialmente cuando se manifiestan de forma inusuales, sobre todo para actuar mejor contra ellos, contra el poder y el Estado. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, María. No, pero sí está abierto. Bueno, estas fueron las 3 ponencias de este primer panel. Pasamos ahora a preguntas, comentarios que tengan tanto asistentes como ponentes. Same, if you have any questions or comments, this is the time for comment section. Yeah. You hear Travis? It's okay sound or more or less? Okay. La salida de audio de aquello.
Para que salga.
Bueno.
Vamos. ¿Qué pasa en este momento? ¿Que no salga?
Si se pone el micrófono de Alejandro, se retroalimenta.
Entonces hay que apagar esto. ¿No?
A ver.
A ver.
Y la volvemos a poner. Travis, can you hear us better now? Okay. So if you have any questions, Anthony has left. Anthony se fue.
Yeah.
Okay.
Entonces no vimos a si ellos no responden, ¿verdad?
No, veremos aquí.
Si queremos hablar a ellos.
Okay. Para hablarles a ellos, sí. Okay. Pero no sé si tienen preguntas, Anthony o Jean María, o digo Travis o Jean María o Tom. O aquí si tienen preguntas para los. Qué barbaridad.
Próximo mandamos por correo.
Exacto.
No sé si hay unos en YouTube.
En YouTube creo que no tenemos preguntas. No hay felicitaciones, preguntas, saludos, demás, pero no tenemos preguntas. Entonces, no sé si ellos quieren preguntar algo. Pero. Pregúntale a Travis.
Si tienen preguntas, pues sí. Les agradecemos. Sí, decías que tenías una pregunta, pero para Anthony, sí, ya se salió.
Para Travis y Tom, pues nada más comentarles que estas políticas internacionales pues apuntan a ser compartidas en todo el mundo y que pues no es o sea, que debiéramos estar alerta respecto a esta persistente racialización y criminalización de la migración, y que incluso en países de una diversidad migratoria como la nuestra, o de una diversidad étnica tan amplia como en nuestro país, también se vive ese proceso de criminalización. Si eres tan amable de traducir eso que te acabo de decir.
Okay, for Travis and Tom, is just a comment to be aware of the diversity of these kind of measures in different contexts or different states, even here in Mexico, that we have a great diversity of ethnicity diversity. There is a great range of this kind of measures by the state to apply this, you say the global apartheid, right? So this kind of measures to preclude the migration of people to these areas. Obviously, in the global north is quite different from what happened in the south, right? So,
well,
oh, wait. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. No.
Yeah, I should speak.
Yes.
Okay. So it's something that we weren't able to go into, or well, we can say like this: Calais is already an externalized border from the UK, yet it's still remaining within the European territory. But what's really interesting, and also what we see happening in Mexico, also on the southern border with Central America, is the further border externalization from the United States. So what you have is the UK border in Calais, but you also have many of the European borders, which are now kind of extending into the African continent. They're extending into Turkey. They're extending into Niger, into Sudan, to prevent these migration flows from the Horn of Africa or from Western Europe. And so, like, I think we speak from this context where we're living, which is in the UK and which is in Calais, and we're trying to show how there's this externalization happening here. So we give you these examples, but also we can see exactly this externalization and the stopping of migration flows to Europe, but much further from European shores. So I know Tom has been working on this question recently, and if you have some examples you want to share or something.
Yeah, I can speak quickly to that. I think it's what I was trying to far too quickly hint at in my final point, which is, I think it's really problematic just to see, the UK's borders is only happening at the edge of UK territory, or even inside UK territory, or even just in front. I mean, so in and as Travis said, a lot of borders are kind of being externalized by Europe, for example, to kind of North Africa, the Middle East, and things like this. And what we're seeing is, what some people call like a border continuum, that the same, people who are crossing borders will encounter multiple types of borders on their journey, perhaps from to Calais, for example. But I think it's useful to see them all as part of a continuum of borders rather than as all separate national borders, right? An example of how kind of complex, but also how quite kind of neo-colonial some of this externalized bordering is in 2018, Britain and France came to an agreement called the Sandhurst Treaty, which included many things, mostly looking at the border in the Channel between France and the UK. But they included in this an agreement to send officials from France and the UK to the border with Nigeria and Niger in the Sahel in West Africa, in order to work and establish border sites and posts there, and to work with training up local border forces and police, particularly training them how to use this technology, this system called MIDAS, the kind of Migration Information Data Analysis System, I think, which was produced by the international organization, the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, right? And so what we see just in that kind of one example is in this bilateral agreement between these two European countries is to kind of work with these international bodies on kind of constructing borders in, for example, the Sahel in Africa. And that also corresponds with a lot of like domestic policies in Niger under pressure from Europe to criminalize movement within Niger, all as an attempt to kind of enforce Europe's borders further into kind of the African continent and generally control movement around that region. And so I think it kind of complicates our understandings of borders as just like national borders. And I think there's some, I think to understand then what border abolition looks like, we have to understand this kind of global context and the interconnections between these different bordering sites, while also understanding their diversity and their specificity and stuff like that. So I completely agree that that's really important as well.
Yeah, and maybe just, well, I think Tom said it, but we're really trying to understand what does global border apartheid look like today? And we're speaking from the context where we see it emerging in Calais in the UK, but we actually really want to hear from you all about, what does it look like in the Mexican territory or in the, and these things of externalization, how is this working? All these things, we're trying to understand this more. So we want to hear from what you see, and then we of course we want to think about how as anarchists do we respond to this, and how can we approach, is abolition, is this a good concept to think through? Are there different concepts within the anarchist tradition, more of attack, or how do we conceptualize what is the response to this thing that we're starting to see emerge? So yeah, we don't want to ignore the diversity and the specificity, but we speak where we're coming from, which is this context.
En este micrófono. ¿Sí? Creo que sí. Can you hear us? Yep? Okay.
Bueno, nos llegó chat sobre cómo lo vemos desde acá, ¿verdad? Si alguien quiere... ¿Yo? O sea, sería yo de aquí. Es un poco complicado. Se queda de estar más cerca de la... Ahí se va a ver. Dice que no se va a ver. No sé si hay deja mientras el espectro. Una respuesta. Well, I think, do you hear me from here? Yeah? Okay, perfect. Yeah, we think the same. There's a diversity in Latin America with respect, but here in Mexico, as you said, in the last few years, this externalization of the border has been enhanced, with the new government. And you see how all these new measures are applied to try to preclude the migration from Central America or South America. So it's getting previous that this is the new measurements that is trying to apply from the government of Mexico. And even from applying for asylum, the new government that tried to maintain all the people here in Mexico, or people from Latin America, waiting in Mexico before getting their paper accepted in the US. No? So it's all the new measures to keep people from crossing to the United States.
Keep them and control them. So it's important that Mexico is just a passing through country to the United States. So Mexico's government is trying to do the dirty job to contain and control migrants from Central American and Caribbean. So that's a bit different, but the policies are inspired by the same spirit of controlling, criminalizing, racializing, and rising. So migrant women are also a figure that we can see that like a pattern, like a pattern of migrant people who is receiving all these measures on their backs. So all these policies on their backs. So yeah, it's a difference because Mexico is not country that migrants are searching for asylum necessarily, but to make the metaphor with the UK and Europe, Mexico is the channel. So Mexico is like the sea. Mexico is the space where boats are floating and trying to get to the promised country. So it's a bit different, but like, as we said, it's like a shared spirit of control and yeah, like constraining of migration.
Maybe to add to that, I think a lot of those, the policies and the financing comes in the end from the US, right? And so, for example, the largest kind of holding facility in Tapachula, is partially financed by the US. A lot of the bureaucracy is underwritten by US money. And so this is like Todd Miller, for example, wrote about some of these aspects in Empire of Borders, how the US in the early 2000s starts training border patrol all over Central America and is actually actively creating borders, and border policy, essentially with money and like capacity building or training. And there's similar aspects of that happening here in Mexico with the Remain in Mexico policy, which is financially underwritten by the US. This is why we're doing this, right? And the same with like the kind of linking the southern border, which historically has been extremely porous, now actually enforcing it, much stronger, right? And there's political pressure, but there's also this kind of creation of a border force of policies and of money to make it happen. And so it's really kind of this weird extension of the reordering of the world in some ways, where there are constant barriers built up, to essentially, in this discourse to protect the US, or whatever that means. And I think the other aspect is also, the media aspect. in Mexico, where there's a constant kind of criminalization of migrants, right? What used to be much more the discourse and what kind of criticism sometimes evokes that, of this like Latin American, I don't know, brotherhood, or like we're all the same, In a lot of media outlets, it's actually replaced by this criminalization of the caravans of migrants and others. This is kind of, I think, the ideological aspect that support those policies.
I mean, well, if there are other questions, of course we can invite them. But I had a question for you all and kind of what you're seeing in Mexico. Well, just quickly, because you said that Mexico is the sea; it's this place of passage, and that people don't want to stay there. And this is the same for France, and especially for Calais, where we are. But what we see is that exactly as you were saying, through British funding, there are accommodation centers being created in France, and so they make life hell for the people who are here to try and push them into seeking asylum in France and into making France their destination. Unwanted, of course, because they would prefer to go to the UK, but their life is made unlivable here. Meanwhile, they provide this accommodation center and the promise of, having their case assessed, and then they can have money and they can have a place to stay in France. So I was wondering if you could speak, if this is something similar you see in Mexico, where these migration flows are being not only stopped at the border, but then they're also trying to be redirected or confined to the Mexican state to provide, an approximation of the things that people imagine they would have once they get to the US. And of course, Ben can, this was a question, but the conversation can also move, and we don't have to only speak about what we've discussed.
Excuse me if I may. There's also a component to this issue with the border, the migration flows that go up through Mexico, which is the United States using its de facto hegemony in northern Latin America to essentially force countries that want to maintain in the good graces of the U.S. State Department to take on migrants that are supposed to be waiting to be taken care of at the U.S. border through these things they call the safe third country agreements, where the idea, the basic philosophical idea there is that if you're running away from danger in a place such as Honduras or El Salvador or Guatemala for that matter, you should be able to at least be in a safe third country in the meantime while you get processed by border security on the way there. Of course, Guatemala is by no means what you would call a safe third country. The gang and narco problem that you see in Mexico is very much a united phenomenon throughout Northern Central America. And so I think there's also space to discuss the way that these people become essentially stateless as they are waiting indefinitely to be processed by and receive asylum by the United States. I actually live in Guatemala. I am Guatemalan myself. And one thing that's very interesting is the way that the local governments utilize these agreements to essentially paint themselves in a good light in the way that they are managing the migration problem, which they themselves are causing, secondarily to United States involvement in the area throughout the 80s and currently. And if you look at, for example, the camps that they were planning on setting up in Guatemala, they were basically concentration camps. They were supposed to be like out in the middle of Petén, which is literally just jungle, pure jungle with no infrastructure whatsoever to be spoken of. And what I find interesting about this is the way that in general, I'm sorry. democratic governments in general make use of these processes to wash their hands, wash their faces, and also feel like, pretend like, and present to the world that they are facing the essential problem that they create with the existence of their borders themselves.
Yeah, I mean, just to respond to that, if no one else wants to say something, I think this language of safe third country is, very much been adopted by the European Union and also the UK as well. And one of the things that the new legislation does in the UK is it states that anyone who has arrived in the UK via what is deemed a safe third country has no legitimate claim to asylum, because they say, well, you should have claimed asylum in this other safe country, right? And the definition of safe country is, again, very, we can question the validity of that. And, where this is going is they want to, establish a kind of model where the only form of legitimate arrival to the UK for asylum reasons is through resettlement and through camps that are set up in other countries in return for money and funding, and everything else will be criminalized and policed as such. And this is the model that they will go for. I mean, obviously, whether this won't be a smooth process, because obviously it involves negotiations between these things, but what we're already seeing is a lot of pressure from European countries and the EU itself on neighboring countries to receive returns of people, and they use visa sort of regulations as a sort of carrot and stick. They say, oh, we will liberalize visas, but then if people refuse to kind of enforce borders in the way that Europe wants, or they refuse to receive people that Europe doesn't want, then they will impose really strict visa regulations on countries and stuff like this. We see similar with the provision of development aid and all sorts of the use of like European sort of soft power type stuff, as well as, refusing to support militarily and security operations and kind of counterterrorism operations, all these kind of things. Like they are being enlisted in this kind of coercion by European states of its neighboring countries to sort of enforce its borders for it in exactly, I think, that way. So yeah, it's interesting to hear these similarities across these regions for sure.
Is there any other question or comment? Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Travis, Tom. It's been very good discussion. I would like to close here with a panel. If there's no other comment or question, then we will continue in 10 minutes next time. And thank you very much, everyone, who attend. Gracias a María por la presentación. Antes de estar, pero
yeah, thank you all. We're sorry we can't be there in person, but thank you for sharing your comments. And also, it was very interesting to hear how the same things are happening everywhere. So, not interesting, but and we didn't get to this question of what we can do against it. But if you have ideas, that can be next year or email or as you like. Hopefully, we'll speak with you soon.
Sure.
Thanks very much, everyone. Really nice to meet you all.
And nice to meet you. Gracias.
Ya se escapó. Demasiado tarde. Ya no nos viene, ya todos se fueron. Bueno, pues un poquito caótico, pero vamos avanzando. Vamos avanzando en la medida de nuestras posibilidades, de nuestras limitaciones. En unos